Welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Bible Study. In this series of Bible studies, we'll be taking a closer look at the Bible's evidence for the completion of the prolonged Judgment Day and the end of the world occurring in the year 2033. And now here's your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann.
Hello, and welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Bible Study that is taking a look at the biblical evidence for the end of the world in the year 2033. And this is study number 27. Now, we have been looking at really the beginning of time, the beginning of the creation, which was in the year 11,013 BC. We have gone to various scriptures, including the verse in Isaiah 46:10 that said that God declares the end from the beginning. And we've looked at just a little bit of information having to do with the fact that the world, when it's all over with, and according to this biblical evidence that we're examining, that will be shortly in the year 2033, that by that time the total duration of the history of the world would be 13,045 actual years and 13,046 calendar years. So we discussed the focus the Bible has on the number 13 and the end of the world. We could go to numerous passages and scriptures that would emphasize the number 13, either 13 by itself or multiples of 13. And I've mentioned before, whenever you find 13 in the Bible, inevitably the context will have some relationship to God's end time program, whether it be judgment on the church or judgment on the world or the unsealing of the scriptures and so forth. And so we're going to continue with that theme in looking at a passage in 2 Peter chapter 3 that really lays out the history of the world in two distinct periods of time that we could call one period of time the first earth, and the second period of time, the second earth, and we are presently living in the time of the second earth, whose time will continue until the world's destruction. But let's go to 2 Peter 3 and start reading in verse 3. And there it says, "Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts, and saying, Where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. For this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished." Now, I'll stop there for a second. Notice the statement. The world that then was overflowed with water, an obvious reference to the flood of Noah, perished. So God is looking at the first earth from creation to the flood, and we talked about that timeline, 6,023 years, and then the world perished. Obviously, it was not totally destroyed, but in the sense that all life on the face of the earth, that with the breath of life, did die out, except for those inside the ark. And the geographical landscape of the world was definitely altered after that, so that when they finally come out of the flood, or come out of the ark after the flood, it's as though it's a new world. And God is basically picking up on that idea here in verse 6. The world that then was perished. Then in verse 7, but the heavens and the earth which are now. Now there is the statement that is pointing us to the idea that our present earth and heavens existing right now is like a second earth. But the heavens and the earth which are now by the same word are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. And just as I said, this world continues until the last day, and 2 Peter 3 is going to proceed and describe a fiery destruction of our present heaven and earth on the last day. But we'll stop here, and we're going to go back now to the book of Joshua. We just wanted to highlight this distinction God is making between the two earths. First earth up until the flood, second earth after the flood. And keep in mind, we have exact dates for creation, exact dates for Noah's lifespan, and we know precisely the year the flood began, 4990 BC, and the total number of years of 6,023. So, having all this information, let's go back to the book of Joshua, Joshua chapter 6. And in Joshua 6, the people of Israel and the army of Israel have crossed over the river Jordan. So their 40-year wilderness sojourn has come to an end. And now they are about to commence with the conquest of the land of Canaan. And God has promised to give them the land of Canaan. And the biblical language makes references that they will receive it, or really it's a promise to Abraham and his seed, which is to be spiritually understood as Christ is the seed singular, and all that are saved by Christ in him are counted for the seed. And so when God says in Genesis 17, to Abraham, I will give to you and your seed this land for an everlasting possession, he is not referring to the earthly land of Canaan. The earthly land of Canaan is being used as a type, a figure, but it is an impossibility for that land to be received for an everlasting possession, because obviously it cannot, due to the fact God will destroy the whole earth. And where we just came from, 2 Peter 3 describes the world's destruction. It does not mean everything else in the world but the land of Canaan. No, that wouldn't be possible. But every bit and every piece of physical matter that is part of the creation that has come under the curse will be destroyed, including the land of Canaan, the whole Middle East, the whole world. And yet God paints pictures. He speaks in parables. And when we read biblical history, we had better have in mind that the history we're reading is true history. That is, it did take place as God records it. Yet it is an historical parable, meaning we have to look for the spiritual understanding of what is in view. And in the case of the conquest of the land of Canaan, that's pointing to the elect people of God receiving their inheritance of eternal life and the new heaven and new earth. That's the only everlasting possession that's possible. Not this earth, but the new heaven and new earth. So Canaan at times represents the new creation God will create. Well, the first obstacle in their path to the conquest of Canaan is the city Jericho. And Jericho was a great city with high walls. It would have been very difficult and have taken a very long time for Israel to conquer that city in the traditional manner that was, current at that time, which would be to compass the city around about, cut off supplies, cut off any waterways, and basically have a siege upon the city, and then you wait a year or two and people are starving, and they eventually come out of the gates of the city to try and get away or find food or something, and the city falls. But God had a completely different method in mind for his army of Israel, and it points to a spiritual battle, and it points to the time of the end of the world. Now, how can I say that, or how can we know that what is going to happen as we read Joshua 6 is actually instructing us concerning end-time events that have actually some already taken place and are in progress presently in our day. Well, remember what I told you about the number 13. Wherever you find the number 13 in the Bible, you can be sure it has an end-time connotation. It is pointing to the end of the world in one way or another, and so we'll find here in Joshua 6 that the number 13 is tremendously in view. So let's begin reading in Joshua 6 verse 1. Now Jericho was straitly shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out and none came in. And Jehovah said unto Joshua, See, I have given into thine hand Jericho, and the king thereof, and the mighty men of valor. And ye shall compass the city, all ye men of war, and go round about the city once. Thus shalt thou do 6 days. And the 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns. And the 7th day ye shall compass the city 7 times. And the priests shall blow with the trumpets. And it shall come to pass that when they make a long blast with a ram's horn, and when ye hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city shall fall down flat, and the people shall ascend up every man straight before him. Okay, so God is instructing Joshua, and the name Jesus is the Greek equivalent to Joshua, because it is the word Joshua. The name Joshua means Jehovah saves. And here Joshua is a type of Christ who will conquer the world, as Jericho is a type and figure of the world, and within the world is the church. So both are in view. As the walls of Jericho come tumbling down, we can understand and we'll see that it relates to God's end-time judgment program that begins at the house of God, that is the corporate church. And just to show a parallel figure, read Matthew 24. Matthew 24, when the chapter is opening up in verse 1. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And the buildings of the temple are pointing to the churches and congregations of the world. At the time of the end, God will come against them. He will loose Satan as a destroying weapon to infiltrate the church and and to destroy it from within, and the church will be utterly destroyed. That's what you can take away from the language. Not one stone left upon another. There will be no salvation in the church any longer. Once God's judgment begins, it is complete devastation. Well, same here, God is telling them that when they compass the city once a day for 6 days, then 7 times on the 7th day, after that, the priests, when they're compassing the city 7 times on the 7th day, they'll blow with the trumpets, and when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when the people hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city shall fall down flat. Now again, compare 1 Thessalonians with the language that we're finding here in Joshua. 1 Thessalonians 4, which describes the coming of Christ in Judgment Day. It begins in verse 15, "For this we say unto you by the word of the Lord, that we which are alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord shall not prevent them which are asleep. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord." Christ is descending from heaven with a shout, the voice of the archangel, with the trump of God. The language of trumps and shouts is what we find here in Joshua 6:5, when they make a long blast with the ram's horn. And by the way, the word long, the Hebrew word, is the same word we find in Exodus 19. I'll start in verse 10. "And Jehovah said unto Moses, Go unto the people, and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes, and be ready against the 3rd day. For the 3rd day Jehovah will come down." What was Christ said to do in 1 Thessalonians passage we just read? Descend. He will descend with a shout and the sound of the trumpet. To descend means you're coming down. Jehovah will come down in the sight of all the people upon Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai identifies with the law of God. Now, I don't want to get into too much into speaking of Christ's coming and how he comes. His second coming, which is spiritual and has already occurred as he began his second coming when he brought judgment upon the churches and congregations. He's the judge. He's the one that carried out the judgment. And he came through the revelation of his word. He came down upon Mount Sinai, as it were, the law of God. And we also find language that immediately after the tribulation, Christ comes in the clouds, and the clouds can be shown to identify with the commandments of God. And the whole Bible's full of the commandments of God. So here also, Jehovah will come down in the sight of all the people upon Mount Sinai, and thou shalt set bounds unto the people round about, saying, Take heed to yourselves, they go not up into the mount, or touch the border of it. Whosoever toucheth the mount shall be surely put to death. There shall not a hand touch it, but he shall surely be stoned or shot through, whether it be beast or man, it shall not live. When the trumpet soundeth long, they shall come up to the mount. Now, the two English words, soundeth long, is a translation of the same Hebrew word. It's Strong's number 49 that we just read in Joshua 6:5, that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn. Or we could say when they make a sounding long blast. See, it doesn't fit here to have both words. But a long blast with the ram's horn. And in Exodus 19:13, when the trumpet soundeth long, they shall come up to the mount. That's the idea. It's kind of like when you've heard a trumpet player. This is a miniaturized version of what's really in view here. But when you've heard a trumpet player make a long blasting sound with his trumpet, and it goes on, 30 seconds or a minute. That's why it's just a small example. But what God's speaking of is a beginning of judgment and a beginning also of salvation. I'll explain that in a minute, or how it relates to salvation. And it continues, the prolonged sounding of the trumpet continues. Remember what was said of the watchman in Ezekiel 33, I think? When the watchman sees the sword coming, he's to blow the trumpet and warn the people. So there's an aspect to that the trumpet of warning leading up to May 21, 2011, but also the trumpet pronouncing the judgment. Christ descends with the trumpet, a shout and the sound of the trumpet. It is the wrath of God has come. It is upon you. And certainly that's the case with the inhabitants of Jericho, that they will experience, or really sadly did experience long, long ago now, thousands of years ago. But there's another connection also between Exodus 19 and Joshua 6, besides this Hebrew word long, a long blast, or soundeth long. And it is, if we go back to Joshua 6, but keep your hand in Exodus 19, in Joshua 6, in verse 4, it says, and the 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns. In verse 5, and it shall come to pass that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet. And this translation of ram's horn is found in verse 6, also verse 8 and verse 13. And it is Strong's number 3104, the Hebrew word Yobel. Yobel. Yobel is the word for Jubilee. Jubilee. The Hebrew word Yobel, or Jubilee, is found 27 times in the Old Testament, 14 times in Leviticus 25. Let me go over there. Leviticus 25, I won't read all 14, but just to show you the way it's used, we read in Leviticus 25 in verse 8, and thou shalt number 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years, and the space of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto thee 49 years. Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. In the day of atonement shall ye make the trumpet sound throughout all your land, and shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee unto you, and shall return every man unto his possession, and shall return every man unto his family. A jubilee shall that 50th year be unto you. The word jubilee is the same Hebrew word translated ram's horns, except here in 4 out of the 5 places in Joshua 6, it's plural. It's plural. That's why they translate it as ram's horns, horns plural. And really, The correct translation would be, the priest shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of Jubilees, which did not make any sense to the translators. You can see why. And so they thought, well, it must be referring to something else. It must be ram's horns. And of course, God allows translators to mistranslate or incorrectly translate at times in order to hide truth. And the truth God is hiding here has to do with the number 13 and Jubilees. Jubilees. Now, it so happens, and with this we'll have to close our study for today, but in Exodus 19, in verse 13, where we read, when the trumpet soundeth long, they shall come up to the mount, the Hebrew word translated trumpet is Yobel, Jubilee, Jubilee. So you can see when the Jubilee soundeth long is identical to Joshua 6:5, and it shall come to pass that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn. Now there it's singular, the only time in Joshua 6, a long blast with the Jubilee. Jubilee, when the Jubilee sounds long, they'll come up to the mount. Well, we'll have to look at this more, Lord willing, when we get together in our next Bible study.
Thank you for joining us for E-Bible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies and information, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. Until our next Bible study, may the Lord's perfect will be done.